In 1985, Steve Jobs was 30 years old, worth over $100 million, and out of a job.
And I just turned 30, and then I got fired. How can you get fired from a company you started?
He had just been forced out of Apple, the company he co-founded, and most of Silicon Valley agreed on what came next. Nothing. He was a marketing guy who had lost his engineer, a visionary who had lost his company, and for the next 10 years, almost everything he touched lost money. And those 10 losing years are the exact reason Apple exists today. That's what makes this one of the best business stories ever told. So today we're talking about the decade everyone calls Steve Jobs' failure years and why they were the most important years of his life. When Jobs left Apple in September of 1985, he did not go quietly. He sold essentially all of his Apple stock, reportedly keeping a single share so they'd have to keep sending him the annual report, took 5 Apple employees with him, and announced a new computer company. Apple's response was to threaten to sue him. The new company was called Next. And next is what happens when you give Steve Jobs a blank check and remove every single person that can tell him no. At Apple, there had always been someone. There was Woz on the engineering side, the investors on the business, the board on the spending. At Next, there was nobody. Every instinct Jobs had, good and bad, got turned up to maximum. And the result is one of the most instructive, expensive failures in tech history. Start with the logo. Before Next had a product, it had a $100,000 logo designed by the legendary Paul Rand. Jobs asked for options. Rand told him, "I will solve your problem for you and you will pay me." No options. The computer itself was a perfect black cube, a magnesium case, a factory so automated and so beautiful, it could build hundreds of machines a day for a market that turned out to want almost none of them. The Next computer arrived years late, cost $6,500 in its education version, and needed a market that didn't exist. Billionaire Ross Perot put $20 million into Next and later called it one of his biggest mistakes. Over the life of its hardware business, Next sold somewhere around 50,000 machines total. Apple could move that many in days. In 1993, Next gave up and shut down its hardware business entirely. So as a computer company, let's be honest, Next failed. Gorgeous, but over-engineered, overpriced, and unwanted. But 2 things about Next turn out to matter more than all of that. The first one starts in 1989 when a British software engineer named Tim Berners-Lee was working at CERN, the giant physics lab in Switzerland, and wrote a proposal for a way to link documents together across computers. His boss read it and scribbled 3 words on the cover: vague, but exciting. The machine he built it on was a Next Cube. In 1990, he wrote the first browser and the first web server on that machine and named the project the World Wide Web. The first website in history ran on a Next computer sitting in his office at CERN with a handwritten label stuck to the case so nobody would switch it off. It said, "This machine is a server, do not power it down." The failed computer nobody bought is the machine the entire web was born on. And the second thing is the reason Berners-Lee picked that machine in the first place. The software inside the black cube was roughly a decade ahead of everything else on the market. An operating system called NextStep, so far ahead of its time that he could build the entire web on it in a matter of months. Developers loved it. Competitors envy it. And keep your eye on that software. It's the entire ballgame, and almost nobody knew it yet, including Jobs, by the way. Meanwhile, in 1986, Jobs made what looked like a rich man's side bet. George Lucas, the creator of Star Wars, was going through a divorce and needed cash, and he sold off the computer graphics division of Lucasfilm. Jobs bought it for $5 million, put another $5 million to run it, and ended up owning about 70% of a little company that renamed itself Pixar. When he bought it, Pixar was actually a hardware company. They sold a specialized graphics computer, the Pixar image computer, to hospitals and government agencies. And on the side, a small team led by a former Disney animator named John Lasseter made short films mostly to show off what the hardware could do. and the hardware business failed. The shorts kept winning awards. One of them, Tin Toy, won an Academy Award in 1989. And this is where the story stops being cute because Pixar nearly died over and over. The computer didn't sell, the software didn't sell enough, and every year Jobs personally wrote checks to cover the losses. Not venture money, his money. By the early 90s, he had put in so much that walking away, admitting the whole thing was a mistake, and Steve Jobs did not admit mistakes. In 1991, he bought out the employee shares and took full control. Pixar's own first chief financial officer later wrote that by late 1994, Jobs had sunk close to $50 million of his own fortune into the company, and that on paper, the value of Pixar stock, negative. The company was worth less than nothing by its own CFO's math. The only thing keeping it alive was a deal Lasseter's team had signed with Disney in 1991 to try something nobody had ever done. A full-length movie animated entirely on computers. And even that nearly collapsed. Disney kept pushing notes to make the movie edgier, and by November of 1993, the main character, Woody, had turned into a sneering jerk that nobody could root for. The Pixar team screened the early reels for Disney, and the screening went so badly, Disney shut the whole production down that day. Inside Pixar, the day is still known as Black Friday. Lasseter asked for 2 weeks, and the team threw out the script and wrote Woody back into a character with a heart, and the movie got turned back on. The film that saved the company almost didn't survive its own studio. Toy Story opened in November of 1995. It was the first fully animated feature film ever released, and it finished as the highest grossing movie released in America that year, ahead of Batman Forever. It eventually did over $350 million worldwide, and 1 week after it opened, Jobs took Pixar public. By the end of the first day of trading, his stake in the cartoon studio that had been bleeding him for 9 years was worth over $1 billion. Look at the order of events. Apple made Steve Jobs rich, but it was Pixar that made him a billionaire. The side bet, the money pit, the thing every rational advisor told him to shut down in 1991. And the strangest part is that Pixar was the company he steered the least. He ran Next down to the last screw and Next failed. At Pixar, he mostly signed the checks, kept it alive, and let the animators work. There's a lesson in there about stubbornness, and it cuts both directions. This episode is the direction where it pays. While all of this was happening, something quieter was happening to Jobs himself. In 1986, he went looking for his biological mother and found her. And through her, he discovered something that he never knew he had. A full sister who was a novelist named Mona Simpson. The two of them became close and stayed close for the rest of his life. And in 1989, he gave a talk at Stanford Business School and noticed a woman in the front row named Lorraine Powell. The way he told it later, he had a business dinner on the calendar that night, got to his car, and asked himself what he would do if this were his last night on Earth. He skipped the dinner. They were married a year and a half later in a Zen ceremony at Yosemite, and that fall, he became a father again. Again, because Lisa, the daughter he had spent years denying in court, came to live with him as a teenager and stayed through high school. So the man was rebuilding too, not just the businesses. Keep that in mind because it's the version of him that walks back through Apple's doors. Now let's check back in on Apple because while Jobs was in the wilderness, the company that threw him out was proving a point nobody wanted proving. For a few years after he left, Apple actually did great. Record revenue under John Sculley. The Mac found its market in publishing and design. It looked like the grown-ups had won. Then the 90s arrived and it all came apart. In August of 1995, Microsoft launched Windows 95, and people lined up at midnight outside stores to buy a computer operating system. Windows had gotten good enough, and it ran on computers that cost half as much. Apple's answer was chaos. A famous handheld flop called the Newton, a decision to license the Mac to clone makers that mostly ate Apple's own sales, 3 CEOs in 4 years, and a company that had lost its identity trying to be everything at once. By the mid-90s, Apple was in free fall. The company lost over $800 million in fiscal 1996. The year after that, the loss passed $1 billion. And Apple had one more problem that mattered more than money. Its operating system was ancient. The project to replace it had collapsed, and the company was reduced to shopping for a new one. There were two realistic options: a hot startup called BE and Next. You can see it coming. In December of 1996, Apple announced it was buying Next for $429 million, plus 1.5 million shares of Apple stocks that went to Jobs personally. Think about the structure of that deal. Apple did not hire Steve Jobs back. Apple paid $429 million for the failed computer company whose software it needed, and Steve Jobs came in the box. The office role was advisor. Within 7 months, the sitting CEO was out, and in September of 1997, the board handed the company to Jobs as interim CEO. 12 years after Apple decided it couldn't function with him inside it, Apple bet its survival on him. So let's tally up the failure decade, because this is the whole point of this episode. As a computer company, Next failed and sold roughly 50,000 machines. As an investment, Pixar ate close to $50 million of his own money and was valued at negative for almost a decade. 10 years, 2 companies, and by 1994, not one clear win between them. And yet, walk through what he was holding at the end of it. He owned the operating system that becomes the ancestor of every Mac, iPhone, and iPad operating system that exists today. Literally this right here. He controlled a movie studio about to go on one of the greatest runs in film history. He was a billionaire, which meant for the first time in his life, he didn't need anyone's approval. And he had spent 10 years running companies with no adult supervision, making every mistake there was to make on his own dime instead of Apple's. The failure decade wasn't a detour. It was the training. Every tool he used in the comeback got built in the wilderness. The highlight reel calls these the lost years. The real story is that these years built the man who walks back into Apple in 1997 into a company he had lost $1 billion in a year and was, in his own words, about 90 days from being insolvent. What he did next is the most famous comeback in business history, along with the parts of it that nobody talks about. That's the next video, and it's on your screen right now.